So far, I will refresh. Let me start by once again pulling in post. Now, so far you've learned that you can create a post by saying post, new post, and then you manually set the fields. My third post, post excerpt. Just going to do this really quick. Post body, something like that, and then you can save it to the database. Okay, so now if I grab all posts from the database, it will include the third post, and of course, we will see that show up here at the bottom in this case, though we should work on ordering. And real quick, we should fix that as well. Let's go back to posts, like so. Okay, but anyways, give that a refresh. Now it works. There's another way to create a post. You could instead say post create, and then you mass assign the attributes. So I could say title is my fourth post, but there are some things to be aware of here. Excerpt of post, body, same thing. And now if I try to run this, let's see what happens. We get this weird mass assignment exception, and it says add title to fillable property to allow mass assignment on your post model. So you have a little hint what needs to be done here. So let's just follow the steps and then we'll talk about it a bit more. It said go to your post model and then add a fillable property. And it says add title to it. Okay, we're not sure what that does, but we'll give it another try. But real quick, if I run it like this, it's going to say the exact same thing. That's because it's still in memory. We need to refresh this. So I will close out with Control-C, and then once again hit the up arrow key. And hopefully post will automatically be aliased. And notice post was aliased automatically. But yeah, now we get a different error. Field excerpt doesn't have a default value. And this can often be a little confusing. You look at this and you think, well, excerpt was set right there. So why is it trying to use the database's default value for that field when we're explicitly passing it? Okay, this is an important thing to understand. This fillable property specifies which attributes can be mass assigned. And when I say mass assign, I mean things like this, where you pass all of the attributes in bulk or in mass. What we've said here, though, is the only ones we care about, the only ones that are allowed to be mass assigned, is title. Everything else will be ignored. And again, this is for default security. Imagine a situation where you mass assign a new user or an update to a new user. Well, if you're not careful and if you're not thoughtful, users might be able to sneak in some attributes here and upgrade their subscription status or their account status or a role that is associated with their account. So when you set that fillable property, this is your way of saying, well, even if other attributes are included here, the only one that is allowed to be fillable is the title. So now this exception makes a little more sense. You're trying to create a post, all you've provided to the table is the title, and now MySQL is letting you know, well, I don't have a default value for an excerpt, so I can't finish this operation. Now, there are a few ways to deal with this. You could be explicit, title, excerpt, body. So now anything that's not a title, an excerpt, or a body will be ignored. Okay, let's give it another shot. We run it again, create a post, and this time it worked. So notice, what if we also tried to set the ID? We'll do it again. And again, this is to simulate a user maliciously submitting extra attributes as part of a form submit or a curl request. So let's say they want to change the ID to something like this. Well, notice it has no effect because it's excluded. But if you had ID here or you didn't set fillable at all, let's see what would happen in that case. We create a new post. I set the ID to 100,000. And notice, even though maybe you didn't expose an ID input in your form, they were still able to include it and change something in your database that you didn't expect. This is generally referred to as a mass assignment vulnerability that Laravel tries to protect you against. Now, there are a few ways to deal with this depending upon your preference or your team's preference. There is a fillable property here, but there's also a companion guarded property. As you might expect, this does the opposite. Guarded says, well, everything is fillable except for what you provide to this array. So if you wanted to say, well, everything can be mass assigned, but not the ID, you could set that here. So now if we try to do this again, we'll create a post with an ID of something higher. We still get, oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. Let's go to table plus. It's because we did allow a record here. So the next one automatically increments above that. And then bear with me real quick, but I will have to tweak this, won't I, to handle the auto increment. Auto increment should be, we're going to reset it back to 6. Okay. So anyways, you can ignore that part. But anyways, if we bring back PHP Artisan Tinker and we try to create some post with a huge ID, notice that gets ignored entirely. And you end up with a post as you'd expect. Okay, so that would be another way to deal with this. And there's no right or wrong. Some developers swear by guarded, others think, it's too risky. You might miss something. Instead, you should be explicit and always set the fillable fields. But there is a third option that's pretty popular as well. The third option is to disable mass assignment entirely. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do it from a service provider, or you could set guarded to an empty array on your post model. But now you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, Jeff. You're back to that problem that we've been trying to solve this whole time, where the user can mass assign and change the ID on the fly, which means, so what's going on here? Why is this being offered up as a valid option? It's being offered up because if you're worried about attributes being mass assigned, then a perfectly valid protection is to never mass assign attributes in this way. Or in other words, just don't do that. If you don't want the user to change the ID in your database, never provide a generic array that might come from a form request to your post create method. And if you never do that, you never have to worry about mass assignment vulnerabilities. Now, how you respond to that is going to be up to you. I often find that personality drastically affects how developers write their code. So I will leave it to you to decide, do you prefer to be explicit about which fields can be mass assigned? Do you prefer the opposite, where you only guard certain fields? Or do you prefer to turn it off entirely and instead set an internal rule that we never perform mass assignment unless you're in control of the array and you are explicitly setting each key and value pair? But if we're dealing with a generic array from a form request, never, ever, ever, ever pass that to a create method, or there's also an update method on your post model. And that is the approach I use. It allows me to do things like this. Let's find a post, and why don't we update the excerpt? Now we could do it manually, as we've learned in the past. Changed, and then call post save. And I won't submit that. Come back to post. Actually, real quick, a little tip. If I were to say post fresh, that will give me a fresh instance from the database, and you'll see that it brings it back to what we had before. So yeah, I could do it manually, or I could instead say post, update, and then I provide an array here. And that part is okay, again, if I'm in control of these key value pairs. So if I were to do something like this, this is equivalent to setting the excerpt and then persisting it to the database. So if I do post, that has been updated. And if I go back to Firefox, you'll see that reflected here. I hope that makes sense.